Welcome to the Massachusetts Peace Action's third webinar on understanding the past and current Gaza history. This webinar series is presented by our knowledgeable Massachusetts Peace Action board member, Jeff Klein. Again, we appreciate your attendance to learn about this important history. My name is Zarina Memon, and my co-host is going to be Cole Harrison. Today, for Gaza in Context, the colonial history that shaped the modern Middle East series. The topic is Rena Memon, and my co-host is going to be Cole Harrison. Okay, so the topic is Israeli independence and Nakba. Sorry about that, something happened there. This topic includes the United Nations proposed partition of Palestine, Israeli Declaration of Independence, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from 1947 to the present, and the Arab-Palestinian resistance. Since Jeff may have covered some of these issues in part two, and given the new Trump administration, Jeff will expand his talk to include the wider United States presence in the Western Asia, Middle East, and its relation to Israel and the Cold War. This session is being recorded. Chat will be available for questions during the presentation. We will tally the questions. We will have question and answer period after the presentation, which is going to be a little over an hour. And without any further ado, one more thing, the slides for part 1 and 2, I will put links in the chat box for you to have, as well as they'll be available at the MAPA website and the MAPA YouTube channel. Without further ado, here's Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Zarina. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this. And again, if you missed part 1 or 2, you can catch them on YouTube, and I think the links will be in the chat. So I'm going to switch to my slides. Hopefully that will work. Okay, can everyone see the picture of Gaza now?
No, we don't see a slide yet. See your face.
Maybe I have to share again.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go. We see a penguin, 2 penguins.
Okay. How about that?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's something to do to have my face on the screen. Maybe someone can fix that. But anyway, so, as you all know, if you've been to parts 1 and 2, this is not primarily about current events, but of course you need to be mindful about current events. And partly because of that, I'm going to change the focus a little bit from what was advertised to look at the U.S. involvement, especially given the new Trump administration and, what's happening now. I think it's very useful and important to look at the sort of, broader history of the U.S. in the Middle East prior to now. And, but, we need to be mindful of what's happening today. And of course, you're all aware that there is at least a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, and people are hoping to return to the neighborhoods that they were chased out of by the Israeli bombing. Unfortunately, what they're likely to find are ruins like you see now. And of course, whether Israel will carry through on the ceasefire agreement is very doubtful. Even in the first phase, they are still refusing to allow people in Gaza to return to the north of Gaza yet, citing some sort of technical violations of the ceasefire by Hamas, very minor ones, but they're essentially holding thousands of people hostage and keeping them from returning home. Well, you all also probably know that people believe, and I believe, that it was the incoming Trump administration that was decisive in forcing Israel to agree to at least a temporary ceasefire. And even if they don't abide by phase 2 and 3, it certainly is something positive that the people in Gaza get at least a temporary respite from Israeli bombs and killing. And we can only hope that it will lead to a more permanent ceasefire. But time will tell. And of course, it's the U.S. that will be decisive in determining what happens next. So a lot of things have happened at the incoming Trump administration. One of them is this that probably all of you have seen by now. This is one of the vehement Trump supporters, billionaire, almost trillionaire, Elon Musk. And of course, he was at one of the Trump inaugural events, was seen to make what is hard to deny is a Heil Hitler Nazi salute. And he responded variously on Twitter, one of which says, apparently I'm a Zionist and a Nazi, as though that's impossible. But in fact, it is possible to be both of those things. And in fact, during Nazi Germany, not only I mentioned last time that Adolf Eichmann visited Palestine to check it out as a Jewish homeland. Another very high SS official, Leopold von Mildenstein, made a trip to Gaza in 1934 and was so excited by it that he issued a medal to commemorate his visit that on one side says a Nazi travels toward Palestine, and on the other side, and read all about it in the Nazi newspaper, Der Angriff. And of course, as Herzl said, I mentioned in the first session that, the Zionists always sought as allies the people who were otherwise anti-Semitic because both sides agreed that the Jews should get out of Europe. And Nazis believed that before the war until they moved to extermination, and the Zionists accepted that support. It's also very odd to many people that Trump took time out from his inaugural speech to give a shout out to President William McKinley, who probably most Americans have never heard of. Maybe Trump had never heard of before someone put it in his speech. But this is significant because it was under the presidency of William McKinley that the United States, which had already expanded to be a continental empire, moved overseas and gained colonies, Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Hawaii had been an independent country whose government was overthrown by American planters and then annexed by the United States in 1898, along with the Philippines and many other possessions. So I don't think this was an accident. Someone wanted Trump to shout out to an expanding America in the past. And of course, he hoped to expand further by annexing Greenland and who knows what else. So back to the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. I mentioned in the first session a commission that was appointed by President Wilson to look at what people in the Middle East actually wanted, the King-Crane Commission. But realistically, the U.S. in the 19th century and early 20th century was not much involved directly in the Middle East. Remember, when we entered the war, the U.S. did not declare war on the Ottoman Empire, which was fighting the European allies. And in fact, U.S. involvement in the Middle East before World War I was mostly in the form of missionaries. And that was part of the background for the King-Crane Commission. Among other things, American missionaries founded in Beirut the Syrian Protestant College, which eventually became the American University of Beirut that exists today. They founded a college in the early 1900s in Cairo also. So the U.S. did not have big economic interests in the Middle East. And despite the recommendations of the King-Crane Committee that people in the Middle East should have self-determination and independence, the Zionists in the United States were very influential then. And I mentioned last time they were primarily the chief spokespeople for Zionism in the United States were relatively aristocratic and wealthy Central European German-speaking Jews who probably thought that the scruffy Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe would be better off going to Palestine than to the United States. And they had, especially Louis Brandeis, who became a Supreme Court justice, and later Felix Frankfurter also became a Supreme Court justice. They had the ear of President Wilson and important people in Congress. So the United States in 1922 basically adopted the Balfour Declaration as U.S. policy. And of course, the King-Crane Commission, which had recommended otherwise, was buried from history. Its report was not published for many years, and until recently, very, very few Americans had ever heard of it. Now, it is true that President Truman early recognized the state of Israel. In fact, he was in such a hurry that when he wrote the letter establishing this, he didn't know what it would be called, and he had to amend his letter to say the new Jewish state, to change it to the state of Israel. And of course, this was the first time, and not the last time, that domestic politics played a role in establishing U.S. policy toward Israel. In fact, his own Secretary of State was vehemently opposed to this, and hopefully this clip will work.
2 days before the British left Palestine, Truman summoned Marshall to the White House. Clark Clifford was asked to support the case for a Jewish state.
General Marshall started off. The president listened attentively and then said, I would like now to hear from Clark. But as I spoke, I saw Marshall's face getting redder and redder. When I finished, he exploded.
Marshall accused Truman of a transparent dodge to win the Jewish vote.
Clark Clifford did not disguise the fact that Marshall was raging mad. They don't need a state, they don't deserve a state, it isn't theirs. They've stolen that land. These were Marshall's words.
He turned to the president, said, I'm obliged, Mr. President, to tell you that if you should adopt the policy that is recommended by Clifford, I would be unable to vote for you in this coming election in November.
Of course, Truman had been FDR's vice president, and he was up for re-election in 1948. And it wasn't so much, as far as we know, Jewish voters that he was concerned about, because even then, a minority of American Jews were Zionists. It was friends, influential friends he had, and fundraising, which from pro-Israel sources, and of course that continued to play an important role. Now,
2 days before,
we're used to thinking that the U.S. view of the Middle East has always been something like this. That is, with Israel and the countries that are made peace with it as, sort of outsized, and everybody else kind of in the shade. But in fact, in the early years of Israel's independence, and most of the 20th century, in fact, the U.S. view of the Middle East was more like this. And that's why the oldest U.S. ally in the Middle East, long before Israel even came into existence and still today, is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And you could find a picture like this of every U.S. president over the years since the 1930s and 40s. But certainly it remains true. And, there are very few decent governments, and certainly almost no democratic governments in the Middle East. But among all of these bad actors, Saudi Arabia is a main contender for the worst country in the Middle East. And just before we see a little clip, look at this map. Saudi Arabia, the central part of the Arabian Peninsula, was never conquered by the Ottomans or the British, whose colonies are in pink all around the periphery of the peninsula. And the Hejaz area on the over here, the British supported them as the leadership of an Arab state, but they were overthrown and conquered by the Saudis in the early 1920s. And eventually, Saudi Arabia declared itself as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
In 1932, Abdulaziz declared himself a king, and for good measure, gave his name to the country, Saudi Arabia. To unite the kingdom, King Abdulaziz married a daughter of every tribal chief in his realm and produced 45 legitimate sons. Every Saudi king since has been a son of Abdulaziz. How many daughters he produced is unknown. They are not counted.
And of course, the current king of Saudi Arabia, Salman, is the last son of Abdulaziz. And when he dies, his son, Mohammed bin Salman, who was already the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, will move the leadership of the kingdom to the next generation. Now, of course, it was oil that the reason why Saudi Arabia was so important and central to U.S. policy. And hopefully this clip will work. Oops.
The Arabian-American Oil Company, or Aramco, was created to prospect for oil and market it. America's 4 largest oil corporations became the sole shareholders.
When King Abdulaziz went to open the first oil field and he smelled the sulfur, and he was repugnantly surprised by the smell, and they told him, "But Your Majesty, this is what oil, the sulfur of oil smells like." So, let me smell more of it.
So Saudi Arabia was so important to the U.S. that Franklin Roosevelt, who was already, very ill on his way back from the Yalta Conference toward the end of the Second World War, intentionally stopped on a U.S. warship in the Suez Canal to have a meeting with Abdulaziz. And
after exchanging gifts, they got down to business. America needed to lease an airport and Navy refueling station for its war against Japan. But it was the security of the Saudi kingdom that was at the forefront of King Abdulaziz's concerns. He requested U.S. military assistance and training, and they agreed to construct the Dhahran military base. In return, the king guaranteed that the U.S. would always have secure access to Saudi oil.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia. You gave us oil at cheap prices, and we will give you protection. This protection eventually evolved into an American hegemony over the entire Gulf region, and the deal extended to the Gulf region, that this was an American area of influence, and in return for this, it shall be protected from all enemies.
And Roosevelt was very frank in explaining U.S. control of Saudi oil. Here's a clip from a British documentary.
Roosevelt had been convinced by his Home Secretary, Harold Ickes, also responsible for oil policy, that he must declare Saudi Arabia to lie within the American area of interest. To the British ambassador in Washington, he said,
"The Persian oil is all yours. The oil in Iraq and Kuwait we will share. As to the Saudi oil, it belongs to us."
You could hardly have a more direct, example of the U.S. and foreign powers owning the oil that exists under the ground of Middle Eastern countries. And by the way, the U.S. didn't particularly need Saudi oil for its own consumption. The U.S. was then, and through almost all of its history, a net exporter of oil, as it is today. But control of the oil and its exploitation by U.S. petroleum companies was immensely profitable. And of course, strategically speaking, U.S. control of the oil that was needed by the rest of the world gave an immense and important power to the U.S. over the oil economy around the world. So the consortium that was established to exploit the oil of Saudi Arabia was originally called the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, because California Standard Oil was one of the main shareholders, and its headquarters was in San Francisco. A little bit later, in 1944, it changed its name to the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, and in the 1950s, moved its headquarters actually to Saudi Arabia, and eventually it was nationalized by the Saudi government, and since then and now, it's known as Saudi Aramco. And along with the theme that I've been expressing, that this history is still living with us today, one of the principal descendants of this consortium to exploit Saudi oil still exists. It was originally ExxonMobil and now Exxon. And of course, you can see those gas stations all over the country. And of course, oil in the Middle East doesn't mean much unless you can export it to the consuming countries. And I mentioned last time, the British early on had built a pipeline from the oil in northern Iraq through Jordan to Haifa on the coast of Israel. After the U.S. Took over Saudi oil, they also wanted it to have a means of exporting it to the Mediterranean and Europe. And they instituted this new Trans-Arabian pipeline that you see in this lower right. And originally, when it was planned, it was also like the British was going to go and terminate in the port of Haifa. But after Israel achieved its independence and the Nakba, it was rerouted through Syria to the port of Sidon in Lebanon. And by the way, the first independence government in Damascus was somewhat opposed to this project. And that government was overthrown with the collaboration of the CIA, the first of many, many regime change operations initiated and supported by the U.S. So that pipeline eventually was built and terminated in Lebanon and not in Palestine as originally planned. Now, Roosevelt was very explicit in making guarantees to Abdulaziz, the King of Saudi Arabia, that he would always bear in mind the interest of the Arabs, particularly in Palestine. And he later confirmed in a letter that the U.S. would make no decision with respect to the basic situation in Palestine without full consultation with both Arabs and Jews. And it wouldn't take any action that would prove hostile to the Arab people. But as you know, Roosevelt died soon after that letter. And his vice president, Truman, took office. And what might have happened if FDR had lived, we don't know. But of course, under Truman, the U.S. dropped the atom bomb and immediately recognized the state of Israel without any consultation with the Arab countries. Now, besides oil, the other way the U.S. looked at the Middle East was in the context of the Cold War, and which was a global battle between the U.S. and its allies and the then Soviet Union and its allies for influence in the rest of what became the Third World, in particular in the Middle East. And, fighting communism became the main rationale for the U.S. intervening in the Middle East, even though communism was never a serious threat in the Middle East. There were substantial communist parties in Iraq and Iran, but the Arab nationalist governments, independent governments, for the most part, repressed the communist movement and were not interested and, wanted to join the Third World that was in between the two main blocs. But so the first major U.S. intervention in the Middle East was in Iran, and the justification was fighting communism, which of course was a fake rationale, as many U.S. rationales for intervention is. And we, as you probably all know, in 1953, we helped to overthrow the democratic government of Iran. Oops. No sound. Well, sorry about that. I won't play it. anyway, the net result was, you all know, Iran had nationalized the oil in its own country, which had been controlled by the British until then. And in response, the British asked for U.S. help in overthrowing the democratic government of Iran. And it succeeded, brought back the Shah. And but importantly, when the smoke cleared after the CIA initiated coup, it was U.S. companies that controlled the oil in Iran, not British companies. And this was part of the process in the post-war Middle East. It was a gradual process of the U.S. replacing the British as the main imperial power in the Middle East. And one of the key events happened not long after the coup in Iran, and that was the new nationalist leader of Egypt deciding to nationalize the Suez Canal that ran through its country. You remember the French had built the Suez Canal in the 1860s. The British basically took over Egypt in the 1880s and ran it, even though Egypt was nominally independent, but it was a sort of puppet government of the British. When the Kingdom of Egypt was overthrown, the nationalist leader Nasser moved to nationalize the canal.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal. His announcement touches off a rapid series of reprisals and counter-reprisals. Britain freezes all Egyptian funds, and Egypt retaliates with the same measures. France lodges a bitter protest and suggests military action. The 85-year-old waterway, of which the United States is the second biggest user, brings a three-power meeting in London to discuss the biggest threat this year has posed to world peace.
The three-power meeting in London, by the way, was between France, Britain, and Israel, where they planned in secret that Israel would invade the Sinai and that the British and French would use that as an excuse to attack Egypt and retake the canal under the pretense of protecting it from war. And that's what happened. Israel launched an attack on Egypt in late October 1956. And then the British and French responded. By the way, the French also had another reason for trying to overthrow the government of Egypt. They were in the middle of fighting an independence struggle in Algeria, and Egypt was supporting the rebels, the Algerian rebels.
The Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves. Since its seizure and nationalization by President Nasser of Egypt, the vital waterway has precipitated a new crisis in the already tense Middle East. Crack French units are embarked at Marseille, bound for a joint staging area with Great Britain on Cyprus, less than an hour's flight from Egyptian ports, where they are prepared for seizure of the canal by force. Simultaneously, Britain reinforces its garrison on the island for the same eventuality. A naval concentration in the eastern Mediterranean strengthens the military buildup, even as Israel, in a lightning attack, thrusts deep into Egypt to the vicinity of the canal. France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum that all fighting must cease. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo. Following a Security Council veto by Britain and France of a United States motion for a ceasefire, President Eisenhower, after consultation with Secretary of State Dulles, makes a firm declaration of United States policy.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. I therefore have no plan to call the Congress in special session. Of course, we shall continue to keep in contact with congressional leaders of both parties. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, with no veto operating, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
Now, it's hard to imagine how different the U.S. response was to Israel's aggression then compared to now. And also to remember that we're used to thinking of the Republican Party in the United States being fanatically pro-Israel, and the Democrats at least, somewhat equivocating, or some of them. But in the 1950s, it was the reverse, that the Republicans were not very committed to supporting Israel and put U.S. interests as they saw it first, and including going to the General Assembly to ask for a vote when Britain and France had vetoed action in the Security Council. It's the exact opposite of what the U.S. has been doing recently in support of Israel, when the U.S. vetoes in the Security Council and the General Assembly votes overwhelmingly to oppose U.S. policy. But then it was the U.S. using the General Assembly to support its policy. So the British and French had to withdraw pretty quickly.
After President Eisenhower refused to supply Paris and London with oil and money, the English and the French had no other option than to immediately withdraw and leave the reopening of the Suez Canal to the UN Blue Helmets, as initiated by Eisenhower.
So the British and French withdrew pretty quickly, but Israel refused. And as Ben-Gurion had said then, it was their intention to permanently keep the Sinai area and expanded Israel, which was their expectation. And they tried to defy the General Assembly. But Eisenhower really made some very strong statements, something that's unthinkable today. He said in a letter to Ben-Gurion, "It would be a matter of the greatest regret to all my countrymen if Israeli policy on a matter of such grave concern to the world should in any way impair the friendly cooperation between our two countries." I mean, pretty strong stuff. And in fact, a little bit later, Eisenhower went on national TV and he called the Israeli occupation of the Sinai an act of aggression and a breach of the peace, and that demanding that Israel withdraw from the Sinai, which they eventually did in March 1957. This was a great victory, obviously, for Nasser and the idea of Arab nationalism, but also scared the U.S. because Nasser had made agreements, economic and military equipment agreements with the Soviets, and his prestige was very powerful all over the Middle East then and caused a lot of nervousness in Washington. So Eisenhower advanced his policy to counter communism in the Middle East, as he called it. Remember, the U.S. During the Cold War, any nationalist leader who didn't toe the line to the U.S. was called a communist or someone who's serving the communists. And in fact, communism was not, as I said before, not a serious threat in the Middle East, but nationalism was. And following the Suez Crisis, there was unrest and a movement in the direction of national independence in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, Iraq, and this put the final nail in the coffin to British presence in the Middle East. And here's, by the way, up until now, all the newsreels, including this one, are British newsreels, but several of the clips I showed about the Sinai crisis for the first time are American newsreels, because America was paying attention to the Middle East almost for the first time in the public.
Without warning, revolution has swept away the young King Faisal of Iraq and his uncle Crown Prince Abdul Ilah. Iraq becomes #1 danger spot. Veteran Premier Nuri Es-Said is deposed, he has fled, and the Republican rebels have offered £10,000 for his arrest. The tide of Arab nationalism is again in flood. The king is reported a prisoner, the crown prince is dead. Only one thing is certain, the Kremlin is jubilant. Khrushchev was quick to see in Nasser the leader who could weld the Arab world into anti-Western unity. The Baghdad Pact, Middle East bulwark against Soviet expansion, looked increasingly unreliable in spite of vigorous Western encouragement. Faisal, like his cousin Hussein of Jordan, was educated at Harrow, and Britain pinned great hope on these royal fledglings. Some critics say too much hope, and declare that Britain underestimated the changing spirit of the Middle East. Faisal became king of Iraq before he became of age, and on his young shoulders fell the burden of ruling one of the keystones of Middle Eastern defense. No one can question the patriotism and intelligence of these cousins, Faisal and Hussein, seen here together, but events have moved too fast for them, and unfortunately for Western policy. Britain has given Faisal and his government wholehearted support, but the warmth of a London welcome melts no ice in Cairo or Moscow. Oil-rich Iraq, so vital to the Baghdad Pact, is, temporarily at least, in anti-Western hands. The most dangerous crisis since Nasser's star first rose in the Middle East.
So I remind you that in the years following the First World War, the British had put Faisal, one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, as king of Iraq, and another son, Abdullah, as emir and then king of Transjordan, later Jordan, and Hussein in Jordan and the deposed king in Iraq were both grandchildren of those leaders that had been installed by the British. Iraq, before 1958, was nominally independent, but in fact was under British protection, so-called. And that all of that changed in 1958. And by the way, it was the first time the U.S. directly intervened militarily in the Middle East. It sent a fleet to coerce Lebanon into, refusing to participate in this upsurge of Arab nationalism. It was the first and certainly not the last U.S. military intervention in the Middle East. And it also put paid to the U.S. policy of sort of deputizing Britain as the sort of colonial controller of the Middle East. In 1955, we had engineered the creation of what was called the Baghdad Pact, which included Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, all sort of pro-U.S. Countries in the Middle East, and Iraq, which was under British control. And of course, with the overthrow of the British in Iraq, the Baghdad Pact became moot, and it was the final blow to sort of any pretension of British control in the Middle East. And by the way, King Hussein of Jordan, who had been, as his predecessors were, on the British payroll, in effect, were transferred to the CIA payroll, where the current king of Jordan still gets a subsidy, a direct subsidy from the United States. Now, with British out of the picture and the rise of Arab nationalism, the U.S., especially given its alliance with Saudi Arabia, turned to using religion as a weapon in the Middle East. And Eisenhower was very frank in saying that we should use our relationship with Saudi Arabia and its Wahhabi version of Islam as a force to fight communism in the Middle East, basically jihad against godless communism. And Saudi Arabia began to proselytize its particular view of Islam throughout the Middle East, spending millions and millions of dollars. And the result was partly what we see today. And by the way, I mentioned that religion as a weapon in the fight against communism was used in the U.S. and its allies as well. Godless communism became a catchword. And here in the U.S., some of you may be old enough to remember, it was in the 1950s that under God was incorporated into the Pledge of Allegiance, which all school children were required to say. and the motto, "In God We Trust," was put on our money. That doesn't go back indefinitely in the past. It was a product of the Cold War. In the Middle East, it had the effect of, over the many decades, of transforming a largely secular societies such as Egypt and Iraq into much more religiously observant societies under Saudi influence. And here you can see a picture of the graduating class at the University of Cairo in the 50s and one from in the 2000s. And you can see in the 50s, it was very uncommon to see women wearing hijab covered in Cairo. Today, it's almost universal. And not only in Egypt, but in many parts of the Middle East, there's been a resurgence of sort of extreme religious observance of Islam in the Middle East. And again, this has been U.S. and Saudi policy, not just an accident. So moving forward, Israel decided to reenact its previous expansion in 1956 by launching a war against its neighbors in 1967. And I guess it's indicative of how short U.S. memory is, that I doubt if many people watching will understand that the war in 1967 began when Israel attacked its neighbors, not defending itself against an attack by Egypt and Syria. And the Israelis were quite open about this. They saw nationalist Nasser-led Egypt as a strategic competitor in the Middle East, and took advantage of a surprise attack that destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the first day. And from then, it was just a matter of time, a few days, until they successfully expanded to capture all of Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And by the way, as a sign of the U.S. relative lack of involvement, the Israeli army in 1956 and 1967 was armed primarily with French fighter aircraft and British tanks, something which we mostly don't remember. But it was after this sweeping victory of Israel against what were regarded as sort of pro-Soviet nationalist governments that the U.S. began to look at Israel very seriously as an important strategic asset in the Middle East. And this is despite the fact, by the way, another event that very few of you will remember, during the Israeli war on Egypt, a U.S. spy ship, which was sailing in the Eastern Mediterranean, monitoring Israeli communications and Egyptian communications, was attacked by aircraft and torpedo boats by the Israelis. It was almost sunk. 34 American sailors were killed and 170 wounded. And there's a lot of controversy as why the Israelis did this, but we know it wasn't an accident, because the ship was flying a huge American flag, and the Israeli pilots even asked for confirmation that they were ordered to attack because they knew it was an American ship. This was covered up completely, and still to this day, there's never been a satisfactory resolution or reparations for Israel, this Israeli attack. And by the way, part of this is because at that time, the Democrats were in power. This was Lyndon Johnson, and the Israeli lobby in the United States was already flexing its muscles in a very powerful way. Now, this is a reminder that although we all know that Israel has fought many wars in the Middle East since its foundation, but nearly all of them were fought on the territory of its neighbors. Only the so-called War of Independence was partly fought in territory that became the State of Israel, but every war after that was either Israeli aggression and or fought on the territory of its neighbors. Even the famous October War, when Syria and Egypt attacked, it was all fought on territory of theirs that was occupied by Israel. and it was an attempt to gain back their occupied territory. And the 1973 war was the first time that the U.S. began to arm Israel in a serious way. The U.S. under Henry Kissinger, again, had decided Israel was a strategic asset during the Cold War, and it remained that ever since. So this was U.S. policy in the late 70s. Egypt made peace with Israel, which was a huge step. But shortly afterwards, U.S. policy in the Middle East suffered two very important earthquakes and setbacks. The U.S. ally, the Shah of Iran, who was also covertly Israel's ally, was overthrown. And at the end of 1979, the Soviets sent troops into Afghanistan to defend the government that was allied with them. And by the way, the U.S., even before the entry of Soviet troops into Afghanistan, had been covertly supplying the principally religiously motivated opposition to the progressive government of Afghanistan. And Carter issued his own doctrine that again justified fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and again couching it in the idea that the U.S. will take as an assault on them any attack or communist influence threatening its oil possessions in the Middle East. And the rest is probably well known to some of you. The U.S. and the Saudis and Pakistan financed a war led by traditional religious extremists in Afghanistan. Afghanistan became, as was hoped for, the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and bled them severely. And of course, among our allies in that struggle were a lot of foreign fighters, principally from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, led by the then little-known Osama bin Laden and his organization called Al-Qaeda. Not for the first time, Al-Qaeda was on our side in the Middle East. And the result was, after many ups and downs and decades of U.S. intervention, what had been a modernizing, progressive society in Afghanistan was completely overthrown and replaced by various iterations, ultimately the Taliban. And of course, it was a huge setback for the people of Afghanistan, particularly the right of women. Now, during the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, Ronald Reagan was president, and he invited representatives of the Mujahideen, the holy warriors, to the White House. He called them freedom fighters and the equivalent of the American patriots. And of course, again, Osama bin Laden and his deputy were among the key players there. And years later, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been Carter's national security advisor and initiated the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, said, ironically, what is more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? What could possibly go wrong, we might ask? And of course, this is what happened. Our ally, Osama bin Laden, orchestrated the infamous 9/11 attacks on the United States. And contrary to what Bush said then, they hate America for our freedom, bin Laden issued a statement that was very explicit. He supported this attack because the U.S. was backing Israel and in its oppression of Palestinians, because it had instituted severe sanctions against Iraq, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of children dying prematurely, the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, and of course, the liberation of Muslim lands. And following that, of course, we all lived through this. The U.S. orchestrated a campaign to stir up the United States, not to attack Saudi Arabia, where the 9/11 hijackers came from, but Iraq, because it was in the interest of overthrowing a nationalist government then in Iraq by Saddam Hussein, who the U.S. had supported, by the way, in the 1980s when he was attacking Iran. A whole campaign was orchestrated that we all know, everybody knows now, was phony to connect Iraq with weapons of mass destruction and the 9/11 events. And Israel very much supported that. And although by this time, by the time the U.S. launched its attack on Iraq, it had been severely weakened already by the first Gulf War and the long stalemated war with Iran. But from the Israeli point of view, any U.S. military intervention in the Middle East was better than none. Of course, Iran then and now was the main prize that they wanted to focus on. But then Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then out of office, testified in Congress. If you take out Saddam Hussein, I guarantee that you will have enormous positive reverberations in the region. They hope that after overthrowing Iraq, the U.S. would attack Iran. It hasn't quite happened yet, but it's still Israel's strategic aim. And, that brings us close to the future. And of course, the U.S. destruction of Iraq, however bad its government was the key event in stimulating greater chaos and violence in the Middle East. It launched Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS, and so on, which we're still dealing with, and the people, especially the people in the Middle East, are still dealing with. We'll talk about that more next time. Now, I just want to step back a minute. Now, for many of you, these events are new news or unknown or unheard by most Americans. But of course, in the Middle East, people have lived with these events directly, and they're well known. And in fact, the history that we're talking about is second nature to everybody in the Middle East. And in fact, they take a much longer view of history than we do. I point out that all over the Middle East, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, there are the ruins of Crusader castles everywhere that are now tourist attractions. The European Crusaders ruled parts of the Middle East for almost 2 centuries, but now what remains are the ruins of their castles. And I just want to give another example. In Lebanon, there's a place north of Beirut, here's Beirut, called Nahr al-Kalb, Dog River. It's a river that enters the Mediterranean just north of Beirut through a sort of narrow defile of cliffs. And it borders the coastal plain of Lebanon, where all the armies moving north-south along the coast since time immemorial have had to pass. It's a beautiful spot. This is an Ottoman bridge, by the way, across the river. And starting in the Bronze Age, armies that passed this way left monuments on the cliffs overlooking the river. The first one here is by Ramses the Great, Ramses II, in 1269, when he was campaigning in Lebanon and Syria. 500 or 600 years later, an Assyrian king put his monument right next door. And so when the French intervened in Lebanon, and of course, after that, there are monuments and inscriptions of Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Ottomans. And in the 19th century, when Napoleon III sent troops to Lebanon to support its allies in the Maronite Christian community, he left a monument there. And then it was followed by the British, who marked their conquest of Damascus and Homs in 1918, defeating the Ottomans. Later on, another inscription commemorated their occupation of Beirut and Tripoli later in 1918. And the French, General Gouraud, whose troops conquered Syria in 1920 and expelled King Faisal, also made an even more grandiose monument. And by the way, I point out, as I mentioned before, the so-called French troops that invaded Syria were mostly African colonial troops. which French officers from Senegal, Algeria, Morocco, and so on. So it was logical when Lebanon finally achieved its full independence in 1946 that they erected a monument in the same place, and that's the one you see on the right with Lebanese, a photograph of Lebanese officials sort of celebrating it. And the French had erected a huge monument for the glory of the French army on the Corniche, the seaside walkway in Lebanon. And the Lebanese didn't want to take the chance of just destroying it, so they dismantled it and moved it to Nar al-Kalb. And of course, when Hezbollah succeeded in expelling Israeli troops from Lebanon in the year 2000, they also erected a monument in the same place, following the model of the one that Lebanon had issued on its independence, commemorating the dawn of new freedom and the expulsion of foreign troops in the year 2000. So that's just to indicate that this history, which is obscure to most of us, is what people in the Middle East live with day to day. And their historical memory is very long compared to ours. So with that, if someone can report some of the questions or comments, I'd be glad to respond.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was very much fascinating. I learned so much. Your talk was insightful with many historical details that are not covered by our current media. And I will read the questions. I have a few listed here, and I'm just going to go in the order that were given in the chat. So let me just go to the very top here. Some of them may repeat, so pardon that. But can you please share the name of the Nazi who traveled to Palestine? And somebody did respond to that, and they said something about Leopold von Mildenstein. Yes.
Yeah. And by the way, he didn't only travel to Palestine, he attended Zionist meetings during Nazi rule in Germany. After the Nazis came to power, very quickly they banned all Jewish publications except the ones that were explicitly Zionist. And von Mildenstein actually attended Zionist meetings in Germany enthusiastically. So again, you can be a Nazi and a Zionist at the same time, as Elon Musk is demonstrating.
Very interesting how that is still there. And then another person asked about the documentary. Where did it come from? On Clark Clifford video. It sounded like a PBS video or something, or the is that what it was? Okay.
Yes.
And maybe somebody said a Frontline, so I wasn't so sure.
Yeah, there was a Frontline. There have been several Frontline documentaries about the Middle East and about Saudi Arabia. That's where the one about Saudi Arabia was the source of several clips that I used also.
Okay, cool. And then someone else asked, St. John Philby was a British advisor to the king who helped strengthen the relationship with the U.S. oil after oil was found. I don't know if you mentioned.
Yeah, he was,
okay.
You know, the British never ruled Saudi Arabia or conquered it. But the Saudis, the pre-state Saudis, were on the British payroll. That was the British practice throughout the pre-First World War, post-war period, was if they couldn't directly rule, they put the local rulers on the payroll. And Philby was the local British advisor to the kings of Saudi Arabia. By the way, his son Kim was famously a Soviet spy in the British intelligence. That there's a lot of literature and films about him. So that's why he ultimately Kim became a reporter in Beirut after he was forced out of the British foreign intelligence and defected from Beirut to the Soviet Union, where he lived out the rest of his life.
So Zena, I got a couple that I saw in there.
Okay.
One is by Antonietta Jimeno. What is the history and relationship between Zionism and Israel's so-called biblical right to occupy and take Gaza or any Arab land?
Well, we talked about it in the first part. I mean, the Zionists claim that they are the sort of genetic descendants of the ancient Israelites, and therefore somehow they have a right to recapture their ancient homeland after 2,000 years. They also claim, along with that, that Jews are not a religious community, but a national community, which was, a different idea than most Jews supported at the time, and many Jews still don't support it. Again, you can accept that argument or not, but it's like saying Irish Catholics in Ireland and Italy are a nationality. The Zionists in Europe spoke Yiddish or German. The Jews in the Middle East spoke Arabic or Farsi, Persian. And the idea that they formed a national community before the state of Israel doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at it rationally. But that's their claim. It would be like saying, the Greeks should rule Constantinople because it was the center of their religious community for more than 1,000 years. And it shouldn't be ruled by the Turks. It should be ruled by the Greek Orthodox. So you can accept that claim or not. I don't. To me, Judaism is a religious idea, and people can practice that religion or not, but it's not a nationality.
I have a couple quick questions also.
Before you ask your question, do you mind if I call on Abby? She had written in the chat. She has a couple of questions.
Go right ahead.
Why don't we call on her? You're muted, Abby.
Still muted. Cole, maybe you can repeat her question if you know it.
I don't know what it is.
Well, Abby, while you're trying to figure it out, let's move.
Maybe I
finally let me unmute myself.
I'm sorry. I made people.
Sure, no problem.
Be able to unmute.
Two things, Jeff. One is that the 1967 war. I was just heard the way you framed it, and it didn't seem to me like you were saying that they didn't just attack out of nowhere. They had intelligence that said the Egyptians and other Arab countries were going to attack them. So it was a preemptive. That's what I know. That's what
99% of Americans believe. The U.S. intelligence services were absolutely sure that Israel and Syria were not preparing to attack Egypt, to attack Israel. Egypt was involved in supporting a civil war in Yemen at the time and had not moved offensive troops into the vicinity of Israel. And if you looked at that slide, Menachem Begin, who was subsequently the prime minister of Israel, was very frank in acknowledging that Israel took the opportunity to destroy the armies of its neighbors who were not prepared to attack. And by the way, the miracle, sometimes people remember it was a miracle, the Six-Day War. All the U.S. intelligence estimates were that Israel was very capable of easily defeating any combination of its neighbors, even more so since it launched a surprise attack on the Egyptian and Syrian air forces. So again, it's part of the mythology that most Americans believe, but it's not true.
Okay, I don't know those sources. The other thing is that I find it very problematic to connect Zionism, Nazism and Zionism, and to say that, like Elon Musk, the Heil Hitler, or the people who wanted to get rid of the Eastern Jews from Europe, they didn't want them, particularly Chaim Weizmann and his folks, didn't want them coming to England. So they're like, yeah, let's send them to Palestine. But I don't see that as Nazis or people with a Nazi bent were Zionists. And That sounded like that's what you were saying, or that they at least supported Zionism?
Yes. So, again, Theodor Herzl wrote in his diary in the early years of the modern Zionist movement that the anti-Semites and the anti-Semitic countries would be their best allies. And of course, that's true. Not the only, it doesn't mean everybody who supports Zionism is a Nazi, but Zionism was compatible with anti-Jewish racism and Nazism. And the Zionist movement, the pre-state Zionist movement, negotiated with the Nazi government to facilitate the travel of Jews with their property. Jews could leave Germany with their property only if they went to Palestine, not to any place else. And before the war, many Nazis were enthusiastic supporters of Zionism, not because they loved Jews, but because they agreed with the Zionists that the Jews should leave Europe. And that was part of the motivation of Balfour in issuing his declaration supporting the Zionist project. He preferred the Jews to go someplace else than England. So it's not to say that Zionism is Nazism, although you could argue that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza now.
Yeah, but we're talking about Europe in the late 1800s.
Nazis supported Zionism in the 1930s and still today.
Yeah, if you use the word compatible, I'm fine with that. I just equating them, just that language.
I never equated them. I said that Nazis could support Zionists, could be Zionists as well, and they were.
Yeah.
And still are.
Okay.
Okay, got it. So Francisco Manuel has his.
Oh, by the way, just when Elon Musk, performed his sort of Heil Hitler salutes twice, the Anti-Defamation League, which was originally established to defend Jewish civil rights and fight anti-Semitism, they leapt to his defense, as did Prime Minister Netanyahu, who said basically that Elon Musk can't be a Nazi because he supports Israel. And supporting Israel has always been a get-out-of-jail-free card for anti-Semites historically, and it still remains so today.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. I wanted to for you to perhaps enlight us as a question. During the Swiss crisis, the French went to great lengths to trying to convince the British into going to the war, something the British didn't want to, and also were very surprised or irritated that Israeli officials were also invited to that secret meeting where they decided how things were going to be played. And there is a kind of obstination from France more than from Britain in a kind of a revenge. And could we still see from this obstination from French that has been going for a long time also why they have this so strong support for Israel today? The French are some of the strongest supporters, the British as well. Yes. So, how do you see this support today in terms of his historical past?
Well, I'm not an expert on British or French politics, but similar to the U.S., they have important supporters of Israel within their societies. Part of it is inertia from the time of the Cold War. You're right that the French were more enthusiastic in intervening in 1956 against the Egyptians because the Egyptians were supporting the Algerian independence struggle. So they had a second reason. It wasn't just their canal, which was the British motivation. It was that they wanted to destroy Egypt to keep them from supporting independence for Algeria. Today, the Germans are the biggest supporters of Israel in Europe, and you can take that for whatever irony you want. And Elon Musk, by the way, besides making his Heil Hitler salutes, is an avid supporter of the Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, which is the home for the neo-Nazi movement in Germany as well. So, again, Germany gets a get out of Nazi free card for being the most vehement supporter in Europe of Israel and armor of Israel.
But at the same time, AfD in Germany, they are extremely Islamophobic.
Yes. Well, Islamophobia is something that Israel promotes and its allies promote because, Islam is the majority religion of the countries that oppose Israel. So not surprising. It's why the right wing in this country is also very Islamophobic and pro-Israel at the same time.
Okay, why don't we go now to...
Who knows what Trump, nobody knows what Trump believes or is going to do. He's unpredictable, which frightens the Israelis, by the way, because the Democrats were totally predictable. And nobody knows what Trump is going to do. Probably Trump doesn't know what he's going to do from day to day. And that's unsettling for U.S. policy and for Israel in the Middle East.
Zarina, do you want to go to your questions now?
Yes, actually, I'm going to go with one question out of the two. I think one is a weaker question, but the other one is in 43, when Truman was taken over after FDR died and Hiroshima was bombed, you mentioned something about Israel was immediately recognized by Truman. Is there significance on this? Is there any more information you can give?
Well, it was charged at the time. Remember, George Marshall was his Secretary of State, who was very famously was the author of the Marshall Plan, sort of rebuilding Europe and NATO. But like a lot of, people at that time in the State Department, he was, didn't want to alienate the Arab world, particularly the oil-possessing Arab world, by supporting Israel. And he was cognizant of FDR's promises to the Saudis that he wouldn't, sort of throw the Palestinians under the bus. So Truman, who had not much ideology himself, he had close friends back in Missouri who were wealthy supporters of Zionism and contributors to his campaign. And he made the judgment that it was politically important for him to show early support for Israel. And again, then as now, it's not so much the Jewish vote in the United States. Jews are more or less a 2% minority in the United States, but important contributors to political campaigns come from a pro-Zionist point of view. And this was influential on Truman as well as his followers. And by the way, he was wrong that there weren't, even then, that there weren't any people who cared about the Palestinians in the United States, because there were then and increasingly now. And many people believe that the Biden administration's support for genocide in Gaza was a contributing factor to the loss of Harris to Trump. So it's not so much the electoral calculus, but the fundraising calculus that's important for the Democrats.
So I'm sorry, I've lost the name of the person, but somebody in the chat requested you, Jeff, to summarize your thesis that, lies behind today's presentation. He feels like he was getting lost in the weeds of the details and wonder if you could come back to the restate the main points.
So the main point I would make is that it's not correct to imagine that Israel was always the center of U.S. interest and importance in the Middle East, that our alliance with Saudi Arabia and our concern with oil in the Middle East was much earlier and much more important to U.S. policy in the Middle East than supporting Israel. And in the early years, the decades of Israel existed, the U.S., recognized Israel and had diplomatic relations to it, but it was a kind of hands-off relationship. It was the French and British that armed Israel until 1967 and not the U.S. And when Israel was perceived to go against U.S. interests, particularly threatening its relation with the Arab oil countries, a president like Eisenhower laid down the law to Israel and forced them to back down, something which we can't imagine today, although maybe Trump partly did that over the ceasefire. Israel, despite its influence in the United States and its military prowess, is ultimately dependent on U.S. support and weaponry to maintain its dominance over its neighbors and its occupation of Palestine. And if a U.S. government wants to exercise its influence decisively toward Israel, they will have no choice but to back down. And that's what happened in 1956 and could happen today. If U.S. policy changes, Israel will change. And that's a very important lesson for people to learn today.
I have a quick point somebody made. Trump just suggested emptying Gaza of Palestinians. Perhaps it shouldn't be covered today, but if you want to make a comment on that, that would be great.
Yeah. Again, nobody knows what Trump really believes or is thinking about Palestine and Israel. So he made that remark, which has been widely reported, which of course is the dream of the far right in Israel, basically to ethnically cleanse everyone from Gaza and the West Bank. Whether he was serious about it and what he meant by it, it's hard to know. It's hard to analyze Trump's brain, frankly. It may be that the last person that whispered something like that to him, he has a lot of very vehement supporters of Israel and Zionism in his cabinet, as well as some who are skeptical. And, the way his brain functions, the last person that said something to him maybe stimulated him to, make a sort of unmonitored remark. And it's hard to know how serious he is about any of this. And again, that's the thing that makes Israel uneasy, even though his first administration was very pro-Israel, and he has lots of important pro-Israel people in his current administration. Nobody knows what Trump is going to do. And frankly, one unsettling thing is that, pro-Israel money was very important in his campaign for re-election. He got over $100 million from the widow of Adelson, U.S. Casino millionaire. But he's not running again. He doesn't need their money, and so his incentives are different. And whatever they are, we can only know, I think, that it's hard to imagine he could be worse than Biden and Blinken on Palestine. But who knows? Certainly, they didn't vocalize this idea of ethnically cleansing Gaza. And if he's serious about it, that's something worse. It's not going to happen because his suggestion was that the people in Gaza flee to Egypt and Jordan, both of whom have vehemently said they're not, going to participate in the ethnic cleansing of Gaza or Palestine. But, who knows?
I'm going to follow up. There's another version of a similar question in the chat, although she put it as a statement, but I'm going to turn it to a question. She writes, I don't see the difference between Hitler's extermination of Jews and Netanyahu's extermination of Gaza and Gazans. You want to comment on that?
Well, it's not the same, I would suggest, but certainly it's not outrageous to claim that Israel's actions in Gaza are Nazi-like, and of course, we don't have extermination camps for Palestinians. But as I said before, the most apt comparison of what's happening in Gaza, to me, is the Warsaw Ghetto during the Second World War in 1943, when the Nazis basically intended to liquidate the ghetto, killing many people and deporting the rest. To me, there's not a very substantial difference to that, with the exception that, as far as we know, there are no plans for death camps for Palestinians, as far as we understand, although I'm sure there are many people in Israel that wish they would all just die instead. So making that comparison, which I make, is ruled as anti-Semitic by many of Israel's supporters, and I don't agree with that. But that's the way our public discourse works, unfortunately.
There are a lot of people that said very much thank yous to you, Jeff. They feel like they learned a lot This was very informative. Jill L. Akshar especially mentioned that, and a few other people. They can't wait to get the recording, and I said this will be available in a day or two. But Cole, you're in charge of that, if you would like to clarify.
Well, no, it's available now. Whenever we do a webinar, it's immediately available on our YouTube page even during the session.
Oh,
so you don't need to wait. Well, I don't see any more questions, so maybe we wrap at this point. I'll just switch to gallery view so we can say hello to each other. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.